December 21st, 2003, three young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the Top End. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the Top End, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the Top End assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the Top End take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember These three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finniss River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finniss River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's going to happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finniss River were very, very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finniss River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment. And suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river. And before long, he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers. And so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny. And so that's why they leapt in, no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out." And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? You know, they're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down, and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water, back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen. But they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, you know, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight, or tomorrow will be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze, and he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree in that black water is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy. And then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs. And finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on. And then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area. And so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other. And then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile. And so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash, they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water. And so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them. When they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks for a snack, offer to give them one, and proceed to heat up a cup o' noodles in the microwave for about 77 minutes, and then serve it to them in a flimsy paper cup. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same for both platforms. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. 2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. On that particular day, Ron knew before he could do anything else on the job site, the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. And so as soon as he got to the job site that morning, he went in the back of his truck and pulled out a 6-foot-tall stepladder and a drill, and then walked into that particular room. Once inside, he opened up his stepladder and placed it where he wanted it, and then he tested his drill by squeezing the trigger a couple of times. And so once he knew that worked, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps, not to the very top, but just a couple of steps, and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. Now, at first, these holes were very easy to punch through, but when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room where he also needed holes in the ceiling, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. And he didn't really get it because he knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through, and it was just wood, so it really should be going through. And so he decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He needed to really press on the back of this drill while he's pulling the trigger. And so instead of standing on the second or third rung of the 6-foot-tall stepladder, he walked to the very top of the ladder, the kind of dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on any ladder. And from there, he was in a better position to really push this drill into the ceiling. And so he gets in position position and kind of feels like the ladder's fairly stable. And then he lines up this drill where he wants it. He begins squeezing the trigger, and at the same time, he really pushes with all that extra leverage into the ceiling. And as he does that, he feels the drill starting to go into the wood, but at the same time, he's pushing so hard that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet at a bit of an angle. And at some point, he pushes too hard and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron instinctively tried to throw the drill away from him, which is a common practice amongst construction workers. You don't want to land on your gear, it could hurt you. But he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him. And even worse, the drill, when it hit the ground, basically right underneath him, it landed on its back with the drill bit pointing straight up into the air. And so when he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. And so this 18-inch long, 1.5 inch in diameter drill bit impales his head, goes right through his eyeball, goes through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. And so Ron, he hits the ground, but he's conscious. And so without even rolling over, he just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill, and then he traces to the drill bit and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head and he feels the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest. And Forrest, who was in a separate part of the job site, he hears Ron screaming. And so he runs over, he goes in the room, and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. The bit, the 18-inch bit, is still poking through his head. And so Ron is looking at Forrest and then turns to the side to show him that he's been fully impaled by this thing. And Forrest is totally horrified at what he's seeing. He can't believe Ron is even alive, but then Forrest jumps into action. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit, and then he tells Ron to stay where he is, and then Forrest ran out of the job site, ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive in an ambulance a few minutes later, and they find Ron sitting next to Forrest, just with this drill still in his face. Ron is very obviously in shock because he's not making any sound. He's totally conscious, but he's just kind of staring blankly, holding on to this thing. And so the paramedics, they go over and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital. And from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. And so when he arrives at this larger hospital, they rush him immediately to the operating room. And at first, the surgeons attempted to cut off either end of this bit, the part that's sticking out the front of his eye and the part that's sticking out the back of his head. But they realized once they did that, there would still be this huge piece of bit that was stuck in his skull, and that would obviously be a huge problem. And so after thinking about it, they decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. And apparently, as they were doing that, Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes about how somebody needs to come in here and take a picture of me. I probably look so great. And so miraculously, Ron would survive, and he would not even be paralyzed. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye. But all things considered, Ron is okay with that. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. Had it punctured his brain when it went through, that almost certainly would have killed him, but by some unbelievably slim chance, it did not, and he survived. Here is Ron's X-ray. To the next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor. Ever since I started this channel, I have been shocked at the number of home invasion stories I've come across where the victims locked their doors and lived in a safe neighborhood. And so for this reason, I went out and got SimpliSafe. SimpliSafe is an incredibly effective and easy to use home security system. And honestly, for me, a big selling point was they don't send a company to your house to set it all up. I hate that. It's totally an inconvenience. And usually you don't even know how to use the system at the end of it. So instead, they send you this really neatly packaged small small kit, and then using their very easy to navigate app, you build the system yourself. And so for reference, it took me less than an hour to do this, and everything worked first try. So it's very, very easy to use. Also, SimpliSafe will fit any home. It's fully customizable. They have all the cameras and sensors for every type of door and window, and they have lots of cool extra stuff like water sensors, temperature sensors, smart locks for doors, and they even have this really cool outdoor camera that has a massive field of vision. It's got 8x zoom, it's got night vision, and so basically at any hour of the day, you can know what's going on outside and inside your home, and SimpliSafe professionally monitors your system all the time, so if anything were to happen, they would call the authorities. So if you want to feel safe like me and my family, then go to simplisafe.com/MrBallen. If you sign up with that link, you can get at least 30% off when you get your SimpliSafe system. All right, back to the stories. In 2009, 15-year-old Christina Grimmie finally caved and made her own YouTube channel. For years, her friends and family had been begging her to do this because Christina had this incredible singing voice that they wanted the world to hear, but Christina had always been hesitant because she was a bit of an introvert. But that year, Christina was feeling more outgoing, and so she took the plunge, she makes this channel, and in July of that year, she uploads her first 2 songs. They were both cover songs, and she was really proud of them, but when she uploaded them, they didn't get very many views. And so Christina probably was not very excited about making more videos. But a month later, she found herself really enjoying the song Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus. And so she was singing it all the time and humming it all the time. And so finally she said, okay, I'll just film myself covering that song. So she records herself singing this song, she uploads it to her YouTube channel, her 3rd video, and she thinks no one's gonna see it because her first 2 videos no one really saw. But this video is different. It went viral almost immediately, and millions of people saw it, and they loved it. Christina couldn't believe it, even though her friends and family had been telling her all along, you have this great voice, you gotta share it with the world. That's different than actually seeing the results of the world saying, you're really great, we love your voice. And so she saw this huge opportunity, and she began uploading more and more music to her channel, and more of her videos went viral. Over the next 4 years, she amassed over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel. She put out her own album, and she even went on tour with the mega celebrity pop star Selena Gomez. In 2014, Christina auditioned for the TV singing competition called The Voice. This show only allows a very small number of contestants who are all incredibly talented musicians. They get screened really aggressively before the competition even starts. But despite the very intense competition she was up against, Christina still managed to finish 3rd overall in this competition. Now, she might have been a little bit let down that she didn't finish 1st, but that show did wonders for her career because the judges of this competition were mega celebrity musicians, and every time Christina was on TV doing her performance for the competition, the judges would be raving about how talented she was, and that even if she doesn't win this competition, someone's gonna sign her, she's so incredible. And then sure enough, shortly after that competition ended, Christina was signed to a major record label. But despite being considered a star by the masses, Christina still very much viewed herself as being a YouTuber first, which meant despite her mainstream popularity and fame, she continued to upload songs and vlogs to her YouTube channel because she wanted to stay connected to her fans. YouTubers often upload videos that appear very amateur, like not professionally produced. It almost looks like anybody could have picked up their phone and filmed that video. And YouTubers tend to be very candid and show their personality in their videos. And so it makes YouTubers, especially these really popular ones, seem very real and raw and relatable. Unlike traditional celebrities that are kind of outside of society, living in their mansions, living a totally elite and different lifestyle. YouTubers feel like they're your friends. And this was definitely the case with Christina. On her videos, she came off as very humble and gracious and kind and friendly, and so her fans truly adored her. By June of 2016, Christina was still growing in popularity when she was asked to be the opening act for this concert in Orlando, Florida that was happening later that month. She agreed, and then on the day of the concert, which was June 10th, she posted to her social media this kind of shout out to all of her fans saying, saying, hey, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area, come out to my show. And then after the show, I'm going to stick around and sign autographs and meet you guys. That night, the venue where this concert was happening was jam-packed, and most of the people were there for Christina, not the main act. And so Christina, she goes on stage, she has this incredible performance, the main act goes on stage, and then around 10 p.m., the concert ends, at which point Christina comes back out from behind stage and went right out into the crowd and began meeting her fans and hugging them and signing autographs and taking pictures. And then at 10:24 p.m., a man who was a fan of Christina's walked down from the back of the venue and kind of awkwardly gestured that he kind of wanted to get a hug. And Christina saw that, and so she smiled and she walked up to him. She opened her arms to give him a big hug. And when she got just a couple of feet away from him, he drew a pistol and he fired 4 shots into her head and into her body. Christina's brother, Mark, he was standing right nearby and he saw the attack. And so he tackled the shooter and he was trying to get control of this guy. But at some point, the shooter managed to wriggle free. And then he stood up and he kind of walked backwards until he was literally up against this wall, looking at the sea of people that are totally horrified. People are screaming and running and no one knows what he's going to do next. And then the shooter just raises the gun, puts it to his head and pulls the trigger. There were people in the audience who were medically trained who rushed over to Christina and they began performing CPR on her, but there really wasn't anything anyone could do. She would die that night at the hospital. Her killer was a 27-year-old man named Kevin Loibel. He, like many people, had become a Christina superfan, but his infatuation with her became a totally unhealthy obsession. And when it eventually dawned on him that he most likely would never have a romantic relationship with Christina, he came to the conclusion that if I can't have her, no one can have her. And so when Christina put that post out on social media asking people to come to Orlando to see her show and meet her after the show, he took that as an opportunity to go kill her. And so he lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 120 miles away. And so he sees this post on social media. He grabs his 2 pistols, some extra ammunition. He gets a large hunting knife, and then he calls a cab. The cab drives him 120 miles northeast to Orlando, Florida. And then he gets into the venue with his weaponry because there weren't metal detectors and no one was frisking people as they came inside. And so he was in the back of the venue during the show. And then when it was over, he kind of lingered back, allowing other fans to go up and, kind of mob Christina. And then when there was a lull and there were less people down there with her, he strode right down the aisle and he ended her life. Here is a photo of Kevin standing in the back of this venue just moments before the show came to an end. Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called Five Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m. the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially, the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other, and kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer, and so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own, she hops in an Uber, and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. And so they called her, she didn't pick up. They started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest. And he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan. And he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well. But he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat. The car backed up. It started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way, because again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the backseat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates. And he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car. Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to give the like button a massage, but apply too little pressure so the experience is unsatisfactory. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called MrBallen, where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. A family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of 2, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before, and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households. And then the following morning, they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point, the family just felt like there was something off about this. And so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck, or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes. And so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see. And so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out, even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body and they were unhurt. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Nowadays, virtually everything we do in our lives is done either exclusively online or there is an option to do it online. And I think we can all agree that that represents progress. I know that I opt for the online option virtually every single time. But there is one area of our lives that seems slow to evolve, and that is banking. It's shocking to me that in 2021, many banks still require us to actually go into their physical location to handle certain aspects of our account. And I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of sitting in front of a bank rep and making major financial decisions while someone is literally waiting for me. That's so stressful. After signing up with Current, which is a mobile banking app, they send you your very own custom debit card. Here's mine. And then after that, everything is done online. They have a great rewards program. They have a great savings program called Savings Pods. No more pressure, no more inconvenience, just money management done exclusively online the way it should be. Also, Current and I are going to be giving away $10,000 to you all. The way it works is you go download Current using the code MrBallen, and then you could be one of 20 people that receives $500 from this promotion. Okay, back to the stories. Brian Joplin was born in 1972 and was raised in this tiny town in Oklahoma called Hugo. He was a big guy, so growing up, he was always encouraged to play football, and he did, but his real passion had always been working on cars. It was something he loved to do, and he was extremely good at doing. After he graduated high school, he stuck around in Hugo doing some auto body work, but he got this feeling that he should do something bigger with his life. And so in 1992, he decided to enlist in the United States Navy. This was something his family was extremely proud of him for doing, especially his grandfather, who had flown bomber planes during World War II. Following Brian's initial military training, better known as boot camp, he was sent to Aviation Machinist Mate School, which is a military school for military members that teaches you how to be a mechanic for all things that fly. And so after Brian breezed through the school, because he was already a very skilled mechanic, and so it came to him naturally, he was sent to his first duty station out in California. And so he joins his California unit, and immediately he excels, and he becomes one of the very best mechanics at his unit, despite being one of the most junior. And while he was in California, he also met his wife, Belinda. And so over the next several years that he was in California, and then he moved around to Texas and a couple other places, he just continued to shine at work. And at home, he and his wife began building a family. They had 2 daughters. And so by and large, everything in Brian's life was going exactly to plan, until Brian made a terrible mistake. Fast forward to October 4th, 2005, and Brian, who was 32 at the time, was deployed with his unit to Bahrain, which is a country in the Persian Gulf. That particular day, Brian, along with 2 other mechanics from his unit and 2 pilots from his unit, had been tasked with flying from Bahrain north to Kuwait, which is another country in the Persian Gulf. This was a routine flight, about an hour long. It was one they had made several times during this deployment. Brian was not really looking forward to doing it, and neither were the other people that were on this particular flight. But Brian decided the way he would make this trip less monotonous and boring is he would perform the stunt. So Brian and the other 2 mechanics, they load in the back of this helicopter in the cargo area, so the passenger area of this helo, and the 2 pilots, they load into the cockpit. And within a couple of minutes, they were 125 feet off the ground, careening forward out over the Persian Gulf at over 120 miles an hour. Brian and the other 2 mechanics in the back of this craft had elected to keep the back loading ramp that folds up and down to allow people to come in and out of this helicopter. They had decided to keep it down for this flight. So basically, they had this huge opening that just looked straight down to the earth. But this is a very common thing in the military. Lots of helicopters, when they're flying around, have either a side door open or the back ramp down, because it provides an incredible view, and more importantly, it provides this amazing breeze inside of the cabin. A few minutes later, when the helicopter is way out over the Persian Gulf, Brian decides now is a good time to do this stunt. And so he looks across at the other side of the helicopter and kind of signals at the other 2 mechanics. It's super loud inside of the back of a helo, and so there's no way they could have spoken to each other besides with a headset, and they were not about to speak about the stunt over the headset because they didn't want the pilots to know. And so Brian signaled to the other 2 because they were totally in on his stunt he was about to do. And so they grinned, and one of them pulled out a camera to be ready for what he was going to do. And then Brian disconnected his helo lanyard. So inside of a military helicopter, you'll find all these metal eyelets, these little rings all over the floor, the walls, the ceiling, and these are there in order to attach cargo or strap things down, or to attach yourself, a person, inside of the helicopter. And so the way you do that is by using your helo lanyard. It's this belt you wear that has this special strap that comes off the front of it, and at the end of this 1 or 2 foot long strap is a carabiner, a clip, and you clip that onto any of those eyelets. And so that keeps you from flying out of the helicopter if the pilots need to maneuver suddenly, or if you lose altitude. Anything can happen inside. And so Brian removes his helo lanyard and then grabs this stretch of nylon rope. It was like a crudely built safety harness that kind of functioned like a helo lanyard, in the sense that there was a carabiner on one end, and on the other there was a way to attach it to yourself. But unlike it being this belt and kind of high-tech system that attached to him, it was really just kind of a slip knot on one end. end of this 10-foot long line. And so Brian most likely had built this 10-foot long safety harness for this particular stunt, or someone else had. But either way, he picks this up after detaching his helo lanyard, and he puts the loop end of this 10-foot line, the slip knot end, over his head down to his waist, and then cinched it tight. And then he very carefully stood up and walked towards the back of the helo, and then he clipped the end of this 10-foot line with the carabiner into one of the eyelets on the ground, right where the back ramp begins to go down. And so once that was in place, he turned and looked at the other two mechanics and gave them one more thumbs up, and then he got down on his hands and knees and he begins crawling backwards down the ramp. And so once he gets to the very edge of this ramp, so literally right behind him is just the open air. At that point, he grabs with his left hand one of those metal rings that are on the actual ramp itself. He gets a firm grip with one hand, and then with his right hand, he grabs the side of the ramp. There's some metal framing there. And so once he had a good grip and he felt confident in it, he kind of slowly lowered his lower half until it slipped off of the ramp. And as soon as it did, the winds outside the helicopter, the 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they immediately swept his legs up and kind of held them in the air horizontal like he was flying. And so he's holding on to the back of the ramp, but his arms are kind of tucked up near his chest. But once he feels his legs up in the air, he slowly extends himself. And finally, when they were fully extended, he was officially doing the Superman stunt. This was called Supermaning, what he was doing. And as soon as he was in this position, the other crew members inside of the helicopter, they knew this was it. Let's take some pictures. And so one of them got their camera out and took some pictures of him. And Brian knows he's getting pictures taken. He's holding on as tight as he can. And then after the pictures were taken and Brian looked up and kind of got the thumbs up that he was good, he began trying to pull himself back into the helicopter, but he lost his grip. And as soon as he lost his grip, those 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they whipped him backwards, and the safety harness that he had strapped around his waist, that's the only thing that caught him from flying away from the helicopter. And so Brian attempts to try to grab the ramp, but it's too far away, and as he's getting pulled by the wind away from the helicopter, that harness that was around his waist, it rides up until it stops right around his chest. And so at that point, he keeps his arms pinned by his side because he doesn't want the harness to slip up over his shoulders, because then he will fall to his death. But because this harness was self-tightening, as he was whipping in the winds, the wind was pulling him so hard away from the helicopter that it was tightening that loop around his chest. And so his chest got so tightly squeezed that it caused him to pass out. And as soon as that happened, his arms that were holding that harness in place, well, his arms went limp, and then the wind whipped his arms over his head, and the harness immediately slipped up over his shoulders, off his head, off his arms, and he went flying 125 feet all the way down to the water below, where he died. There were at least 8 people that were punished for this incident, including the 2 crew members in the back of the helicopter taking pictures, because they were totally in on this. But the details of the punishments were never made public. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers came out of the wilderness and went straight to a newspaper to tell them about this otherworldly place they had found. And so the newspaper sat down, they got their notepad out, and these explorers start describing this place. And they say, okay, well, it's this huge expanse of wilderness. And in the middle of it, there are all these boiling lakes that are either neon green or yellow or red or all of those. And they're shooting boiling water into the sky. And there are these breathtaking waterfalls and snow-capped mountains, and there are bison and elk and wolves and bears just free roaming the whole area. And so the newspaper, they take all this down, and at the end of it they say, okay guys, well, unfortunately we don't publish fiction. But these explorers weren't lying. They were describing an area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park, which is this massive expanse of wilderness in Wyoming that sits on top of a volcano. And those boiling neon green, red, and yellow lakes really do exist. Those are hot springs, and they are the result of water passing by and making contact with underground magma chambers. Today, Yellowstone is so popular that every year millions of people go to the park, and so as a result, the park employs hundreds of people year-round to keep up with tourism. Many of these employees are young people, like college students, and in addition to being paid for their work, the park also offers them the ability to live in employee housing, which are basically dormitories dormitories spaced all across the park to make it easier to just be on site and do their job. And these dormitories are either free or very low cost. And so these young people typically take up that offer and will stay inside of these dormitories for as long as they're working at the park. And so in 2000, a 20-year-old summer employee named Sarah Hulfers, she was staying in one of these dormitories in the park, and she was in her room when a group of other young employees that were staying in this dorm came down the hall, and they knocked on her door and they asked her if she wanted to come with them to go swimming. And so Sarah, she had a day off and she wasn't doing anything, and so she said, sure, I'll come with you guys. And so after they all got their bathing suits on and got their towels and snacks packed, they left the dormitories and got into a couple of cars, and then they drove over to this dirt lot that was right up against this huge forest. And so they parked, they got out, and they make their way over to this trailhead that begins in the parking lot and goes straight into this forest. And so they walk down this trail until the trail goes right out of the forest and brings them to the edge of this river. And this river was called the Firehole River. It was called that because the surface of this river steamed, and it gave the impression that this river was on fire. The reason this happened is some of the water flowing through this river would pass by those underground magma chambers, warming it up. And so this is a lot like the hot springs, except on a much smaller level. The hot springs are boiling, whereas this river was just slightly warmer to the point where it would steam. So totally safe to swim in. So Sarah and the rest of this group, they come out of that trailhead and they're standing on the edge of this beautiful river, and they walk down to the edge and they all jump in and they have this great day. They're swimming around, they're playing games, and they were only expecting to be there for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that before long, the sun had gone down and they were still in the river. And so when it was dark out, they finally climbed out of the river and they toweled off, and then they realized they had a bit of a problem. Because they did not expect to be there for as long as they were, no one had brought flashlights, and the way back to the parking lot would be going along that trail through the forest, but that was a pretty far trail, and it's totally pitch black out. There's no ambient light. And realistically, there's some pretty big animals that live inside of that forest. And so some people in this group were a little bit nervous about walking through this forest. But ultimately, about half of the group said, you know what, whatever, let's just run through the forest and get back to our cars as fast as we can. I'm sure nothing will happen to us. And the other half decided they would look for an alternative route that would skirt the forest and allow the moonlight to be their guide along the way. That second group was made up of Sarah, along with two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. So Sarah and these two boys, they're standing there and they're watching the first group go into the forest and disappear. And then she, along with these two guys, they turn right and they begin skirting the river and walking around the forest. And so they walk downstream with the river on one side and the forest on their left, and they're walking for a while until they see up ahead on their left, it looks like the forest is starting to thin out maybe a little bit. And so they took that as an opportunity to cut left and basically begin kind of going straight towards the parking lot, which was generally off to their left. And so they make that turn, they start walking, and the terrain is relatively open. It's this big open field with a couple of trees here and there. It was pretty easy to navigate, and they felt like, hey, we found a great alternative route. The moonlight's still shining through. We got great visibility. And so they're walking along happy as can be, and then they see there's a couple of streams up ahead. They get to the first stream, and it's not that big, so they jump across it. They get to the next stream, it's still not that big. They jump across that one, and then they get to this third stream, and they realize, you know, it's still pretty small, but it's significantly bigger than the last two. And so if we mistime it, we could fall into it. Now, this was not some huge deal. They were already wet from having gone swimming, but they didn't want to jump in this stream. And so they considered walking off to the right and trying to find an area that was more narrow they could jump across more easily. But they figured they were probably within maybe 100 or 200 feet of the parking lot. They couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And they really didn't want to go farther and farther away to only have to just jump over this thing anyways. And so they decide, you know what, let's just jump across it. Let's just do it. If we fall in, we fall in. And so the three of them backed up from the stream to give themselves some running room. And then they grabbed hands. And at the same time, all three of them ran forward and leapt across the stream. And they cleared it. They landed on the other side, but the ground they landed on was kind of loose and soft. And so it kind of crumbled underneath them, and they all fell backwards into the stream. In the darkness, this stream had looked like the other two streams they had seen, albeit a little bit larger, and so they were not thinking this could be potentially hazardous if they fell into the water. But it would turn out this stream was extremely hazardous. It was nothing like the other two streams they had encountered. This one was runoff from a nearby hot spring, and so the temperature inside of this stream was 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was practically boiling water, and it looked like it was shallow, but in fact, this stream was 10 feet deep. And so when this trio fell into these scalding waters, they let out blood-curdling screams, and the other group that had ran down the forest path, they had got to the parking lot and were waiting for them, and so they hear this scream, and they just take off running in the direction of the screams. They cut right through the forest, and they come out to that field, and they find Lance and Tyler are on the edge of the stream, desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the water. And so the parking lot crew, they run over, and they grab Sarah, they pull her out. They don't really know what's happened. They don't know this is some boiling stream, but it very quickly dawns on them when Lance and Tyler and Sarah just continue to scream outside of the water that something is horribly wrong. And so one of the people in the parking lot crew, they take off running, they go into one of their cars, and they drive and they get help. And not that long after, a helicopter would arrive, and it would take Sarah, Lance, and Tyler to a nearby hospital. It would turn out Lance and Tyler, when they fell into this water, they only submerged up to their necks, and as soon as they hit the water, they immediately turned and got themselves out again. So they were only in the water for maybe a second or two. And these things ultimately saved their lives, although they did still have burns over almost their entire bodies. They had to go through dozens and dozens of surgeries and years of rehab, and they had to pay all this money for medical bills. So it was not a smooth course after they got pulled out, but they lived. As for Sarah, she was not as lucky. When she fell into the water, she completely submerged. Her head, her body, all of it went under the water, and then she just could not get herself out again. And so she stayed in the water much longer than the guys did. When she was admitted to the hospital, despite the fact she was talking and conscious, the doctors very quickly realized they had a big problem with her. A third-degree burn, or a full thickness burn, is when the outer layer of skin gets destroyed, and also the inner, deeper tissues of the skin also gets destroyed, including the cells that are responsible for reproducing skin. And so if you get a third-degree burn, that part of your body will not heal on its own. You literally have to get a skin graft, and a skin graft is effectively a skin transplant. They will take other sections of skin from your body that are unburned, and they will place them over that site where you have the third-degree burn. But when Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, it was determined that she had third-degree burns on 100% of her body. So there was no unburned skin to use for a skin graft. Her whole body was ruined. And so despite their best efforts, Sarah would pass away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year later, Lance's family would sue the National Park Service for not having put up a sign near that particular stream to warn people of its dangers. But that lawsuit was tossed out because it was determined that the trio, Sarah, Tyler, and Lance, had chosen to walk off trail in a known thermal area, and so they were being negligent, not the park. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button has an itch on their back, offer to scratch it for them, but then continuously misunderstand their directions so you never actually itch the right spot. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.